Hello, good evening. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to Medyascope series, jointly organized by ELIAMEP. These series are sponsored by the CAT Network, Center for Applied Turkey Studies, and the Turkey program of Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, ELIAMEP, has joined forces with Medyascope, one of Turkey's leading free and independent electronic media organizations, to foster a pluralistic dialogue on key issues of Turkish domestic and foreign policy. The ELIMED project consists of 7 75-minute webinars in the format of roundtable discussions, as we're having today, and there will be policy papers published at the end of each webinar. Organized by members of ELIAMEP's Turkey program in collaboration with Medyascope, the ELIMED webinars and papers aim to foster a more informed and sophisticated debate in 7 important areas. These include future of Turkish governance and the role of media and women in Turkish public life, as well as youth politics and activism, as we are discussing today. I would like to welcome our participants, Professor Ayhan Kaya, Dr. Bilge Yabanci and Dr. Haydar Darici. First of all, I would just like to introduce the topic, and then we will start our webinar. So we have been observing that Turkey has been going through a transformation since the AKP has come to power. And firstly, there were hopes for a democratization and for some political reform, but in the end, what we're experiencing today is an authoritarian turn, and some experts call Turkey a hybrid regime now, while others are still defining the regime type as competitive authoritarianism. So under this regime, we have observed that a new generation has emerged, a generation that has lived under the Erdogan regime since they were born, and they have not experienced any other political leader. So while the elections are approaching, we see that some media experts as well as academics have turned their attention to the Turkish youth. Can they be a game changer? What kind of political movements do we see in Turkey today? So we're observing that all political parties from left and right are trying to mobilize young people for their own purposes at home and abroad. We see all these established movements such as Kurdish, Alevite, leftist, LGBTI, green activists, as well as Muslim youth organizations going through different kinds of transformations during the last couple of years, since the Gezi protests especially. We also see new grassroots movements emerging as a result of different political developments. Some are becoming more established, some are just sporadic, like especially what we observe on social media. For example, after the students' loans were cancelled, we saw young people took social media platforms to thank Kılıçdaroğlu, for example, rather than Erdogan. This was a short-lived moment, but it was a youth movement still. Or we see what's going on at Boğaziçi University today, and how young people from the alumni, but also students of Boğaziçi are reacting towards this political development. So youth are active, but we need to discuss what kind of agency they have in Turkish politics today. So if you look at the literature on Turkish youth politics, we actually see that only a few systematic studies have been conducted so far. And youth studies in Turkey are not as established as in other case studies in the MENA region. So we have seen, for example, for the last 2 decades, the concept of waithood has been discussed immensely for different MENA countries. And especially after the Arab uprisings, we have seen many academic papers emerging all around the world. So we have seen this kind of a trend after Gezi protests in Turkey, but now we have a new wave of interest in Turkey's youth politics. So youth movements in Turkey have their own dynamics. So they are similar to other youth movements all around the world, but they have their own dynamics, and they reflect already existing cleavages in Turkey. So the question was that then I mentioned in the beginning, can youth act as a game changer in Turkish politics today? So let's look at the statistics. 50% of the Turkish population is under 30 years old. And if we look at the Generation Z, they constitute around 13 million voters in Turkey today. This constitutes 5% of the eligible voters. So they have leverage to a certain extent. And we should also consider that 7 million of these people will vote for the first time in their lives in the next elections. So many survey companies showed interest in youth politics, and then they come up with different results. And but most of them consider the current problems that young people are having today in Turkey. This includes unemployment, which is around 25% at the moment for young people, economic crisis, quality of education, the diminishing quality of education, to be precise. Young people do not have confidence in the judicial system anymore, and they have criticisms with regards to new laws and which control social media. They mention inequalities, social, political, and economic inequalities, and also the recent developments about the Istanbul Convention, for example, created a resentment among young people in Turkey. But that doesn't mean that all young people criticize the government. So there is a sizable young community in Turkey which also support the current government and the current rulers of the country. We have seen that Gezici Survey Company conducted several surveys and found that young people have different opinions than their parents. They actually influence their parents' ideas about politics. We have seen a Turkey report which found out that 58% of young people do not show any interest in political participation in political parties or civil society organizations. So can we consider this as young people staying away from politics? So there is some youth discontent. Also, there is youth loyalty for the governing party. So how do we evaluate youth social movements today in Turkey? So this is what we're going to discuss today. So I would like to pose a question to all the experts we have here, but I would like to start with Professor Ayhan Kaya. So my question is, what kind of youth movements have emerged in Turkey since the AKP came to power, and why did they emerge? What led them be active in different political platforms in Turkey? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bahar, for the introduction as well as for the invitation. Let me just say a few words about my own conceptualization and also periodization of youth movements in Turkey, retrospectively speaking, and then come back to your question with a specific focus on the changing face of youth movements during the Justice and Development Party regime. In the literature, we have two different forms of youth political participation. We are all familiar with the conventional forms of political participation, and recently we are more exposed to unconventional forms of youth political participation. By conventional forms, we all know actually that we used to enjoy voting. We used to, enjoy running for office. Sometimes making donations to certain candidates, or writing to the members of the parliaments for certain claims. But these were all old conventional forms of political participation. However, lately, over the last probably 2 decades, in the Turkish context at least, we are more becoming exposed to unconventional forms of political participation. We have seen a lot of different marching of young people, boycotting of young people, disobeying to the laws, civil disobedience, young people becoming more and more reactionary, radical, and protesting about so many different things. So we have seen lately in 2013 during the Gezi protests, the young people have shown us that so many different ways of political participation were possible. So this is the first thing to underline. The second thing, how do we need to make a periodization of youth political participation in Turkey? I have 2 ways of looking at this. One way of periodization is as follows. I think we can talk about the generic, form of youth participation before 2000, before the European integration process started, really. And in that period, we have seen a lot of young people who were accommodated within the Kurdish, political, ethnocultural movement. We have seen an Alevi youth movement. We have seen an Islamist, youth movement. So they were mostly based on ethnocultural and religious claims, probably because of the rise of the identity claims since 1990s and even earlier. And then I've got a second layer of youth political mobilization in Turkey between 2000, I would say, and 2011, where we have seen a growing electoral forms of political participation, thanks to the Europeanization of Turkish politics, Turkish state, Turkish society, etc. So we have seen the heydays of electoral political participation of youth in between 2000 and 2011. However, things radically changed since 2011. This is actually what we are going to talk about today. Since 2011, since the consolidation of voters of the AKP, because remember, in 2011 general elections, Justice and Development Party received 49.5% votes. So this was the moment when Erdogan and his entourage consolidated their power, and this was the time when the regime started to become more and more authoritarian, judiciary becoming under the control of the government, and also the media, and also the ways of doing business, etc., etc. So this was the time when the young people started to follow a rather more unconventional forms of political participation. When we look at the claims of young people since then, since 2011, we have seen clearly that there was a discontent against the Islamization of the state and society in Turkey, number one. Number two, there was a very strong discontent, growing discontent against the imposition of certain lifestyles over especially young, secular-minded, liberal-minded people. And the third, growing environmental claims, the claims that we have seen very clearly during the Gezi protests. And finally, we have seen a lot of claims revolving around the right to the city. So this was one way of classifying the very recent history of Turkish young people's movements in general. Another way, this is very briefly, if you allow me, we could also, make another alternative periodization. We could argue that there was a rather more class-based youth movements before 1980 military coup, and then after the 1980 military coup, we have been exposed to rather more new social movements, because 1980 coup resulted in the introduction of another, curricula, which was put into force in 1986, creating a totally different individual, totally different citizenry. And this citizenry, young people we're talking about, started to become raised with a rather more Turkish Islamist, culturally nationalist, and religiously Islamist, conservative young people. It was then the young people started to become more identity based, generating more identity based politics, as well as sometimes ecological, sometimes environmental, sometimes cultural, sometimes urban claims were put into the agenda. So if you follow the second line of thinking, then we could briefly argue that, while there were class-based old social movements in the past until 1980, and after 1980 we have more new social movements based on several different identity-based political claims. If you like, I can stop here. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Professor Kaya. May I just ask then, what kind of social movements do we see now? Can we give us examples, and what are their aims? And more importantly, how can we define them? Are they peaceful or are they conflictual? Thank you.
Well, we have seen, new social movements, for many actually decades, at least for the last 2 decades. But I think Gezi movement was a really important, a moment in the history of youth movements in Turkey, with a lot of diversity of claims in those days, and still actually the repercussions of the Gezi movement continue very much, although we don't really see them.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as I can see, those claims have been successfully appropriated by different political parties. For instance, CHP, especially in Istanbul in the latest elections in 2019 local elections, the success of the CHP in Istanbul and in big cities was partly based on the idea of appropriating the Gezi movement and its claims. So what did they appropriate? Well, first of all, they used very well the claims of the young people against the Islamization, against the neoliberal governance of the Justice and Development Party, against the clientelist governance of the Justice and Development Party, against the construction-based growth of the Justice and Development Party, against the faith-based charities of the Justice and Development Party at the expense of right-based approach. So this was different, young people trying to reassemble the social, something like Bruno Latour would put it. So against the efforts of the ruling party to kind of polarize the society, the young people are trying their best to reassemble this polarized society in a way.
Thank you, Professor. This was a wonderful introduction to our topic, and I think now Dr. Yabanci's work really complements what you have just told us. So I would like to turn to Dr. Bilge Yabanci now, who has worked on youth mobilization, especially from an AKP youth perspective. So, Bilge, could you reflect on these topics from your own area of expertise? Because you've worked immensely and you conducted field work in Turkey, but also abroad, about how the AKP is mobilizing young people today. So if you could share your thoughts with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bahar, and all the organizing team for this invitation. It's great to be alongside this great audience, great speakers. Indeed, I second everything Professor Kaya said. He had a great introduction in terms of periodization. What I can say is to kind of also share my research about how this area of youth movements, youth organizations have been shaping by also another current, particularly from 2010, 2013 onwards. Because I feel like we need a bit of qualification here also. What do we mean by youth movements or youth organizations? Obviously, youth is not a single uniform body that a single movement can represent all youth. There are young women, there are young LGBT, young refugees, there are young women refugees, diaspora youth, Kurdish youth, nationalist youth, religious and conservative youth, and so on. So it is very difficult to pinpoint a youth movement and to understand the diversity of youth movement and or actors engaging with the youth emerged in Turkey during the ruling period of the current government. We need to look into basically two factors, two interrelated factors over the last 2 decades that have unfolded as a part of the gradual decline of democratic governance and regime change in Turkey that Professor Kaya mentioned. The first is clearly the government's approach to youth and young people. And the second one, the state of social movements or state of civil society in general that has itself also gone through a profound transformation that is of polarization along a more pro-government and more autonomous and oppositional line. So starting with the first issue, we know that youth is an object of interest for all types of regimes, of course. We know this from the literature. All types of political actors from left to right corners of political life consider youth as a long-term pool of electorate, a substantial socio-political group. So it's not surprising to see that all parties and political actors feel obliged to reach out to young people. But the question of youth becomes a little more complicated. That triggers a closer interest, a special attention to youth under the special circumstance of this gradual democratic backsliding and regime change that Turkey over the last decade or so has been going through. And this is why we see a clear interest from the AKP in shaping youth's political and ideological attitudes. And this was clearly expressed by President Erdogan many times, and repeated by government representatives like raising a pious generation, cultivating a social hegemony, besides the political hegemony, through basically raising this national and authentic youth. Cherishing at every instance the so-called 15 July youth against Gezi youth. And the government is obsessed with the idea of youth as the pioneers of the future. In this sense, the youth is considered, on the one hand, as a lethargic entity, vulnerable to degradation by radical, liberal and leftist influence. So they are in need of constant training and indoctrination. And on the other hand, we see from the political discourse that the AKP imbues youth with almost a Herculean task of rebuilding Turkey as a powerful nation. So youth is one of the key groups for the AKP, as a group to be courted, to be organized, trained, also entertained, as well as protected, so that they can be the new adherents that internalize the goals and value system of this new regime that the AKP has been gradually building up. Of course, adults can be convinced, but the perpetual political education is considered more suitable for youth because their habits, way of life, and ideological orientation can be shaped also for the future. So towards this end, of course, the government employs several agents of socialization. A family is one important medium to train them, to educate the youth. And I must say the family and women policies in this sense cannot be discussed separately from the AKP strategy of this creating desired youth. The other social agent the AKP utilized or tailored for youth long-term indoctrination is school. We know that the education system has been reshuffled countless of times. But besides family of school, a special type of youth movement in the form of government-oriented, government-organized youth organizations has also shouldered an important duty in cultivating this national and authentic youth suitable for internalizing the new regime's value system. So there is this semi-corporatist sector within civil society working on specifically youth and education, and they are organized as formal associations and foundations, but they are not a product of young people's initiatives, but they are more encouraged and guided top-down. Yet these organizations have managed to co-opt and incorporate young people from different corners of Turkey and different sociopolitical backgrounds, thanks to their financial, political, bureaucratic support that they receive from the government. And this debate emerges and subsides quite often in public debate in Turkey, because some journalists reveal some information, and then the main opposition party, CHP's leader, also was revealing some information about the top management level of this organization engaged in some clientelist, corrupt activities. But my research shows there is more to this story beyond the top level management of these organizations, the way that they engage with the grassroots. So The most active of those youth organizations have achieved countrywide presence. When I say countrywide, I mean some of these youth organizations are mobilized in every single city, as well as through branches in provinces and also districts in big metropolitan cities. And this extensive organizational capacity has been developed in a few years and should be evaluated against the fact that most of the established youth organizations have only a few branches in the largest cities like Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir, and have no means to reach out to rural areas. And these youth organizations have a very status orientation when they engage with their target audience, that is the young people. And my informants mentioned that it is the joint responsibility of the state and civil society organizations to ensure that youth receives the right guidance. So they combine their ideological status orientation and their remarkable organizational capacity to effectively bring the state, the government, to young people, namely by penetrating everyday life, becoming a part of the daily socialization, activities, and routines of young people, trying to create a mobilized youth bound to the ideology and value system of the government. And often this is the state and nation, loyalty towards the state and the nation. Through their local presence and grassroots engagement, they have created spaces of interaction. And in many areas, they have become the center of politicized leisure. So they have set up myriad of institutionalized ways of reaching out to youth from different age groups, different corners of life, including rural youth, working age or school age young people, first-time voters, university students. And they are organized at public schools, but also outside the curricular schedule through camps, dormitories, some extracurricular training offered free of charge. And their premises offer socialization through libraries, internet, especially in rural areas. These are not freely and readily available for youngsters. They also offer informal gatherings, for example, through free film screenings, seminars, reading groups, and cultural events. They have also, interestingly, capitalized on contentious action, like protests, demonstrations, like the new social movements, including in Turkey, but also organizing some diaspora youth abroad, particularly in Europe. It's quite interesting because usually contentious action is affiliated with progressive politics in our minds. I mean, a tool of minority groups or subaltern groups. Yet through these government-organized youth organizations, we see that they can well be utilized towards support of power holders. Youth organizations, in this sense, engineer political attitudes of youngsters through protests, demonstrations, mainly for two reasons. To display mass support for the government when it faces domestic political crisis, or to show support for a specific foreign policy that promotes the Turkish government as the leader of the third world or the Islamic world, often organized as solidarity marches and protests and demonstrations concerning conflicts in Syria or Yemen civil war, Muslims in Malaysia, Palestinian, Jerusalem issues, so on and so forth. So the type of political agency formed in such settings out of such encounters are very nationalist and conservative one. So my encounters with several youngsters at the premises of these organizations confirm that for many youngsters, their first point of contact with the state, with an authoritarian state, happens through these politicized leisure activities. And youth organizations, if I may add, these youth organizations also actively campaign through electioneering. During critical election times, they carried out such a campaign that sometimes can become more effective when it comes to reaching out to youngsters than the AKP party organization or the party's youth wing, because by using their vast organizational network, they could tailor their campaign for more efficiency, for a wider audience, especially reaching out to first-time voters through their network of dormitories all around Turkey, or those youngsters who were not engaged in voting or politics before. And they have, again, run social media campaigns, physical information desks at key locations in big cities, seminars at universities. Volunteers, for example, patrol the streets to convince youth to vote, particularly during the 2017 constitutional referendum for a yes camp. They made door-to-door visits to shopkeepers or women that do not work, by visiting them at their houses. So this is clearly one side of it. But of course, as Professor Kaya was mentioning, this is not the only type of youth mobilization that emerged over the last decade. And this is because under gradual autocratization that we see also an increasing differentiation of youth movements, particularly in general civil society organizations and social movements. And this polarized civil society ecology in Turkey closely affect youth movements also, as Professor Kaya mentioned, that there are also network groups, organizations that have an autonomous and oppositional stance. And this brings me to my initial point about the multiplicity and heterogeneity of youth as a group. So we cannot speak about a single youth organization or movement that would be sufficiently large enough to incorporate all these cross-cutting demands. But maybe we can mention further other types. I get to mention other types of youth organizations, youth movements in the later round.
Thank you so much, Bilge. I think this was really important, and I mean, your presentation gave us a fantastic idea about how state-led mobilization might happen and how young people can actually support authoritarian governments or become part of its, part of cog in the wheel, more to speak. So I am interested in the diaspora aspect as well, as you mentioned, but this will be my next question. But before that, I would like to turn to Dr. Haydar Darici. And I think it's very important to talk about the heterogeneity and multiplicity of youth movements. And so far, we haven't really touched upon the Kurdish youth. So hopefully, Haydar will cover that part. I think that Haydar is a rising star in this topic, and his article on the Kurdish children and youth and how they perceive childhood and political memory was one of the best, if not the best article on this topic. So Haydar, in your previous work, you mentioned young people and how they become, politically active without even realizing it, if I'm correct, and how they were perceived as vulnerable by the Turkish, system before, and suddenly their image turned into a criminalized, stigmatized image where they are depicted as glue sniffers or pawns of a terrorist organization, etc. So the Turkish media really criminalized Kurdish young people starting from the 90s onwards. But I want to ask you more about the contemporary youth movements that we see today in Turkey, especially how the collapse of the peace process impacted upon youth mobilization among Kurdish circles. I find it extremely important because, whether people accept it or not, I think Kurdish politics are directing where Turkish politics would go in a way, because they determine the agenda of political parties from left and right in a positive or negative way. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Bahar, very much for the invitation. I should note that first, my observations are based on ethnographic research I conducted in Cizre and Adana and my follow-up visits to these cities in the last 10 years or so. In the early 2000s, a new youth movement emerged in the Kurdish region. This movement was based on insurrectionary forms of protest. Almost every day they took to the streets. They clashed with the police using stones, Molotov cocktails, fireworks. And I can say that these protesters were moved by their history of colonial displacement and dispossession. They also articulated very much, their aspiration for autonomy, for a life beyond the control of the Turkish state. But what attracted my attention was that these protests occurred in the mode of gameplay. In a way, the police and the protesters gamed each other. Of course, this was a deadly game, and it was deadly only for the protesters, not for the police. For instance, my interlocutors used the analogy of soccer games to describe their protest. They said when they got tired during the protest, they would take a break, negotiate with the police and take a break, like the end of the first half of a soccer game, and after the break, agreed to both parties, that deadly game would continue. These protests resemble game playing also because they involve some interesting concealment tactics, such as dissimulation and impersonation. The protesters try to use these tactics to protect their identities from state surveillance. They also wanted to protect their identities from possible spies, posing as fellow protesters. They believed that the police had deployed spies to infiltrate their struggle, whether true or not. So they developed various concealment tactics, and they, for example, wore masks, and they used pseudonyms, they changed the way they talked, the way they walked. They assumed a type of another gender, like cross-dressing, and they even created imaginary characters and role play during the protest to kind of make themselves unidentifiable. So you can then say that they could appear in the public sphere only as somebody else, right, or no one in particular. But this experience of becoming another also afforded you the space of freedom. It temporarily, at least, allowed them to distance themselves from their social identities and from a life dominated by extreme poverty and ongoing political violence. And my interlocutors often mention like how they kind of put their real life aside during the protest, how they forgot about their troubles during the protest. Of course, this is a tragic thing because they can create that space of relief only by putting their lives on the line, right? And many were arrested, many were killed, many were injured. And this kind of activism, however, came to an end after the war, urban warfare, in between 2015 and 2016. And the public, after this war, the public sphere, which is the street in the Kurdish region and probably in other parts of Turkey, was closed down. And a public space that was opened with the when the AKP came to power was closed down by the same regime during that war. And since then, the so-called, I would say, the so-called digital public space of Twitter, Facebook, maybe TikTok, replaced or displaced the street. This is a so-called, I said like so-called because it's this public space is not public. It's privately owned. But I maybe later can talk about as a general statement, like why this kind of protest actually cannot transform political structures. Maybe it has a concrete function in their lives, but as in general, I think cannot really transform political structures. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Haydar. I just have one more follow-up question. So, we have seen in academic articles and discussions, but also on TV and in media, saying that the new generation Kurds, the Kurdish young people, are not as reconciliatory as the previous generation. So their understanding of the peace process and a potential resolution to the quote-unquote Kurdish question in Turkey is different than the previous generation. Have you observed such trends during your interviews. So I don't want to use the word radical as used in other places, but I'm just asking about the difference, generational differences in terms of defining what peace is for Kurdish people.
Yeah, I would say that they put much emphasis on resistance, to the states, and in a way, I think these kind of politics in general, they kind of reduce politics to resistance, and not. I mean, I'm not talking about only like a peaceful politics, but also like a constructive politics. Maybe like a concrete political program can change, political structures. Yes, I would say, but it's mostly because of that too much emphasis on resistance.
Okay, thank you so much. Then I'll go back to my question about the diaspora, because I think it's very important nowadays. Turkish state is investing immensely in youth and other networks outside Turkish borders as well. Call it public diplomacy, call it diaspora diplomacy. So what kind of youth movements can we observe outside Turkey? What does the Turkish state do to mobilize young people abroad? And both Bilge and Professor Kaya have worked on this issue before. And Haydar, if you have any insights to share with us, please feel free to do so. So I would ask Professor Kaya first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bahar. Just about the diaspora, I think we need to take a look at the agenda setting of the Turkish society, and mass migration of the Syrians in 2011 and afterwards has really radically changed many things in this country. It has changed the ways we as scholars worked about certain issues, because we needed to understand what was going on with this mass migration of more than 4 million people. I can visualize myself what I was working before myself as a social scientist, and then what I had to work on after the mass migration of the Syrians. I can tell our audience that we were studying, we were researching very different things before 2011. Not only the things that came up in terms of young people's movements, youth movements, but also about other things. For instance, in relation to the impact of diaspora on the Turkish politics and society, there is a huge literature where we, for many years, argued that, well, many of the social movements and political movements in Turkey were actually driven from diaspora. I can just very easily remind our audience that, well, we talked about, let's say, Milli Görüş, National Outlook movement, which is actually originally a diasporic movement going back to 1990s and even earlier. We talked about the Kurdish movement, which is also partly driven from diaspora, especially since 1990s. There was a lot of problems in this country, but the democratic atmosphere in diaspora in Germany, France, and elsewhere has really strengthened the Kurdish movement in diaspora, which later had great impact on the Kurdish political movement in this country. Alevi movement, exactly the same. LGBTI movement is exactly the same, originally coming from diaspora. At least this is what I see. And even Gülen movement, even the Gülenist circles were actually, mobilizing themselves first, let's say, in the United States or elsewhere, and then having an impact on Turkey. So all these things, in a way, remained there before 2011, before 2010. And since then, we don't really talk about these things. What we talk about recently is the movements as as Bilge has already talked about, this state-led, political movements. We have seen quite a number of vigilant groups organized by the ruling elite in this country, actually in diaspora. So there are several different vigilant groups. For instance, Osman and Germania was a vigilant group which was recently banned by the German authorities. Or the Grey Wolves recently becoming very much mobilized by the Turkish leading ruling political parties abroad. So there is this very close connection between diaspora and Turkey, mainly because of the globalization of Turkey starting in the early 1990s. This was a very healthy moment, but over the last 10 years, I could not really detect a lot of, closeness in terms of different, youth movements in diaspora and in Turkey, so to speak. So this was my answer to your question about the diaspora. But let me just, if I can add something about this digital activism, as Haydar, pointed out very well. I'm also skeptical about this digital activism. If I'm following, Roland Barthes' way of thinking. If there is too much of something, then that thing doesn't really exist. If activism is everywhere, then there is no activism. If politics is everywhere, then there is no politics left. If romance is everywhere, then romance is no longer there. So this is why I'm skeptical. But I also see that young people are trying to find some new venues of expressing themselves through social media, through digital activism. We are all very familiar with the rise of right-wing neoliberal or right-wing populist movements across the world. But there is also the emergence of a rather more populist left-wing activism, which started, let's say, in Tahrir Square, and then in Occupy Wall Street, and then Gezi, and then Maidan in Ukraine, and then umbrella movement in Hong Kong and everything. I think we could frame them as new left, social movements prevalent in the social media or in the digital platforms. But one thing that needs to be added into this discussion, I think, especially during the pandemic, things have changed. Of course, there was no other outlet but the social media or digital platforms. But we have also seen a growing tendency of what we call in the literature, active citizenship. There is this discussion we are all familiar with, if the young people nowadays are political or apolitical. I'm, arguing that they are, on the contrary, very political, and they are very active citizens, because they come up with great creativity, great humor, satire, parody, music, spontaneous street gatherings, different acts of solidarity that we have seen during the Gezi and afterwards. We have witnessed over the last 10 years several different environmental protests, such as the protests against the destruction of olive trees in the Aegean regions of Turkey, or the protests against the construction of hydroelectric plants in the East Black Sea regions, or protests against the construction of the third bridge over Bosphorus, and several other protests. So these are active citizenship movements coming from bottom up, so to speak. So I think we just need to change our perspective to try to understand the new forms of political participation of youth people in Turkey as well as anywhere else. Thank you.
Thank you, Hocam. Thank you for these insightful comments. And I would like to come back to this digital activism. And I'll ask a question to Haydar in a minute, because I think it's very important to discuss this, especially from the perspective of slacktivism. So how much of this activism is actually turning into a meaningful output in the end? So I would like to hear Haydar's opinion on the Kurdish context. Bilge, do you want to add to this discussion? On the diaspora aspect?
Yeah, that maybe very briefly, but before I might slightly disagree with Professor Kaya about if activism is everywhere, it's nowhere, because when I say this, I'm sure Professor Kaya will agree with me, because one clear theory that is called feminist theory would say activism is everywhere and has to be every day, especially under the current circumstances that we are going through in Turkey, we are seeing in Turkey, because private is political, private is politicized, and this is why activism, it has to be everywhere. If we have time, I would very much like to discuss young women's activism, but before that, I would briefly add something on the issue of diaspora. Bahar, of course, you have written extensively on the issue of how Turkey's under the AKP government approach to diaspora policies of institutionalized diaspora policy has changed, and this was partially a reaction to capitalize on the resentments of diaspora groups that they have faced over decades, even second, third generation diaspora members, as like not being accepted, not being embraced by the host, by the integration societies, particularly in Western Europe. And AKP has used this very well to reach out to second, third generation diaspora youth. Be integrated there, but also you don't forget your Turkish roots. I mean, many young diaspora people maybe have never considered themselves as totally Turkish, but with the new outreach policies of AKP, maybe they started to reframe themselves as proud Turks also living abroad. And we have seen how AKP has capitalized on this as return for votes, but also, as I said, these mobilization activities when the AKP faces a challenge abroad, particularly to limit host state governments' criticism towards Erdogan and AKP. And it has been a great way to capitalize on as secondary citizens that never fully acknowledged, never fully integrated, always at the margins of the host societies. And it has been a strategy, and AKP has done it again, trying to kind of co-opt the diasporic civic space, as Professor Kaya has already mentioned, by true vigilant groups, but also official diaspora organizations, several of them, including kind of a corporatist civil society organization, an umbrella organization with a youth branch in there. So this actually brings me to the issue of a new diaspora group in the making in Turkey, the Syrian and other refugee groups, and the youth that belong to that group. I mean, we have a new generation that was born, that is now being raising up in Turkey, that they speak maybe Turkish more fluently than Arabic. And then the question is, and this is a question for not only AKP, but in the looming post AKP era, that all opposition parties should really stop being delusional about and consider. The question is whether we want to see these young people given a chance to realize their full potential, becoming a fully contributing members of society, or we want them to feel exactly like the Turkish diaspora youth feels in Western Europe, or maybe Haydar would say that, or Kurdish youth has been feeling over decades, right? And this is the major question, I think, that in the looming post-AKP era. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bilge. I mean, when we talk about youth activism in Turkey, we should definitely mention other groups, such as the Syrian refugees, etc., because there are many diasporas in the making in Turkey at the moment, and these young people will be active. They'll be also pushing for more rights, for more recognition. So I think this is a very important topic as well. So turning to Haydar again, I just wanted to ask about the Kurdish perspective again. So as Professor Kaya mentioned, Kurdish movement was mobilized outside Turkey, has mobilized outside Turkey for a long time, and then tried to influence homeland politics from afar. They were really successful in organizing demonstrations and protests, and they basically exposed human rights violations in Turkey to the outside world when there was no digital media. So now things have changed. So diaspora Kurds are mostly active on Twitter as well. So they have these hashtags, Twitter Kurds, etc. So they keep exposing human rights violations on a daily basis and asking for recognition and rights. But do you think they have an impact on the daily lives of Kurdish young people who live in Turkey or even in Syria, Iraq? So there's so much activism. So I slightly agree with Professor Kaya in this way. I think many people share things on social media, and they feel that they have a good conscience, but at the same time there's no positive change in terms of pushing structural inequalities and violence to a distance. So how do you think about this? Do you think diaspora has an impact on daily lives of Kurds in Turkey?
Well, I think, yeah, definitely those kind of social media campaigns affect politics on the ground. But I think social media, I'm not talking about like social media activism, but social media platforms were already an integral part of this protest. We see that protests are conducted in a way that to attract media coverage, right? You see that protests are becoming more and more theatricalized, also because only that way they think they can be visible, right? And I think this dependency on media coverage, or this dependency on visibility, is also a bit problematic, I think. And anthropologists, for example, Rosalind Morris argues that like today, you can be considered as a political actor, or you can consider yourself as a political actor only when you turn into an image, when you create an image of yourself. And when we just focus on visibility, when we just focus on self-expression, we kind of leave aside, the other function of politics, right? Creating, struggle for equality, transformation of the consciousness, and so forth. So that's why I'm a bit skeptical about this.
Thank you so much, Haydar. So my next question is then, we talked about activism mostly, so what young people are doing on different sides of this oppositional politics or contentious politics. So I would like to talk about the survey results with regards to migration of young people outside Turkey. So some surveys even show that more than 70% of young people actually plan to leave Turkey for a temporary period or permanently. And this hasn't been a surprise in a way, because I'm sure you also receive a lot of emails from young students in Turkey who want to come abroad somehow and asking for advice. This is happening to me regularly nowadays, and it wasn't like that just 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. So there is an exodus from Turkey since the coup attempt, and we can already say that this started with the Gezi protests anyways. But young people are leaving Turkey now. Not everybody needs to be active. Not everybody needs to protest to make a point. I think many young people are also making a point by just leaving, by exiting. So what do you think about this new trend? Do you think the government is doing anything to prevent migration or brain drain? And why do you think young people are leaving?
Well, if you like, I can start, Bahar. Well, I don't think that the government is really very much concerned about the mass migration of young, qualified, educated, democratic, liberal-minded groups of people. I think you know, these are the people, these are the young people who have certain claims, certain democratic civil claims, which cannot be really met by the current government. I remember back in the 2000s, there was another form of migration coming from diaspora, coming from Germany, France, Belgium, Netherlands, countries like this, Turkish origin, young people, thousands of them qualified again, coming to Turkey to get a job here, to run a business here. So in those days, the net migration, for instance, between Turkey and Germany was positive on the Turkish side. So there were more German Turks coming into Turkey than Turks going to Germany. But this trend has changed, especially after 2013, and probably after the 2016 failed coup attempt. It has become even more so. So I mean, I haven't done myself a research on the young people going to places like Germany, but because of my other research, I see that there are serious problems at the moment. Many people had to leave this country because of the signature affair, because of other problems of unemployment, pressure, political issues, etc. And we have seen what the doctors are going through. So, especially because of this political pressure, many European countries, showed some solidarity efforts to help these young people. But together with the rise of the Ukrainian refugees, things are also changing there radically. I mean, those young people who were mostly politically persecuted are now having another difficult period where they are also being like second time, not maybe persecuted, but in a way excluded from certain rights, from certain resources. So when you go to Germany, this is what I observe. There are now different kind of conflicts between the settled, economic migrants in those countries and the new wave of migrants coming from Turkey. So unfortunately, this is how it is at the moment in Turkey. These young people want to have a more democratic, more prosperous country. But unfortunately, they are not going through, very pleasant days in countries like Germany, probably because of the growing economic crisis in these countries, including Germany. We have gas problem, we have inflation in those countries as well. I think we will see more and more young people who are really going through secondary traumas after the first trauma that they experienced here. So we need to work with these people even more. I think in the days to come, Bahar.
Thank you, Hocam. I think this is a very important point, and not only Germany, but nowadays I'm conducting research on the new migration flows to Portugal with Isabel David from University of Lisbon, and many young people are actually choosing countries where there are no prior Turkish networks, so that they can just live their lives free from polarized Turkish politics. So we will be observing new trends. So Bilge, do you have anything to add to this?
Not particularly on top of what I can say on top of my mind, but the thing is that is maybe worrisome is in the end the brain drain, because what we know, the brain drain that happened through mass exodus of skilled, educated populations, let's say during the Balkan conflicts, once they were out, they were settled and they were not keen to get back to their countries, and this might be a major concern again for the post AKP period for Turkey.
Thank you. I mean, what's fascinating is that 70% is a really big number. So not only the oppositional youth, but also AKP supporting youth want to leave the country. So I think this makes a great topic for future research on this. So Haydar, I also wanted to ask you, so you were conducting research at a very critical time in the region, and then the peace process collapsed, and then there was urban warfare, etc. So have you observed any trends among Kurdish young people about leaving the country for good, or is staying where they are and is staying where they are a part of resistance in itself, or do they plan to leave? Is it a tougher decision for Kurdish young people?
Yeah, it might be a tougher decision, but it's very common there too. Like I know many people who were, for example, very politically active a few years ago, before that period, they all now trying to leave the country. I think that is really, in the whole country, it's very common.
Okay, and maybe it got slightly harder with tougher policies on asylum in different countries. So it wasn't like that in the past. But my research shows that now Kurdish asylum seekers are facing a lot of hurdles. And I mean, because of the exodus after the coup attempt, also the numbers are really high. So they have to use unconventional methods to cross borders, etc. So this is what's happening because of the disadvantaged position they have already within Turkey. So I also noticed that among the signatories of the petition, for example, while the White Turks, if I can say, can leave the country as soon as possible thanks to their networks, etc., it was harder for our Kurdish colleagues to leave the country for a variety of reasons. So this is what's happening at the moment. So then my final question is, I said in the beginning when I introduced the topic, now the media is showing great attention to Turkish young people. You can see the headlines in newspapers. Turkish youth will change the course of Turkish political life, and Erdogan is counting on Generation Z, etc. So people have different theories about this. Actually, Generation Z only 5% of the votes compared to the wider audience. But do you think young people have leverage in the forthcoming elections? And more importantly, what do you think political parties are doing to attract young people's support? Are they successful? Because when we talk about youth, as Bilge mentioned, definitions are really important. So we're talking about power relations. So youth is defined, again, by elder generations, and according to their own motivations. What young people should do is also defined by others. So it's like a power relation. So what do you think political parties are doing? And this will be my final question. But HDP, AKP, MHP, CHP, all of them are doing something, but are they successful?
Yeah. Bahar, I can just say a few words about this. As I said in my first intervention about the appropriation of the Gezi movement's tactics by certain oppositional parties, including CHP, E-Party, Saadet Partisi, HDP, etc. I think they were very creative. They were very, successful. For instance, they learned to use rap as a kind of generic form to mobilize young people. In 2019 local elections, rap made a great impact on mobilizing young people for the oppositional parties. And I think they will do the same in the upcoming elections. And during the pandemic, if you remember, when we were all stuck at home, we have been, discussing about the newly released rap songs such as Susamam, as Olay, and then even earlier Tahribati Isyan, talking about the Sulu Kule and the disparities there. So these artistic expressions have been used by the oppositional parties very well, and I think they will continue to do so. In the social media, from time to time, we see the posts of Saadet Partisi lately, which shows that they actually learned how to mobilize young people. And I think we also hear and we see a lot in different occasions that, if there's too much Islamization effort, young people, generate a reaction to that attitude of the hegemonic power. So we see increasing atheism, increasing deism, and increasing alternative forms of political participation. Even just a couple of years ago, we conducted a research among the supporters of the Justice and Development Party, and how they consume the heritage produced by the Justice and Development Party. And we have seen that even among the supporters of the, especially educated supporters, young supporters of the Justice and Development Party, there is a very clear-cut critique of the way neo-Ottomanism is being operationalized by the Justice and Development Party, and how Islamism is being operationalized by the Justice and Development Party. So it is not only among the supporters of the oppositional bloc, so to speak, but there is also an increasing resentment among the former supporters of the Justice and Development Party, who are rather young and educated people. This is what I can see at the moment.
Thank you, Hocam. Thank you. Bilge, do you have anything to add to this?
Thank you. I think I will take this question. Well, next elections are clearly very important, but also beyond the next elections. And I think politicization of youth is a key term, I would say, to describe that youth as a potential change agent in the future, in the next elections, but also beyond. So hit by political crisis of representation, rising undemocratic practices, hit by economic crisis, youth have become very politicized in Turkey. So, and I can also use this opportunity to also mention briefly the remarkable example of young women's movement that has become one of the most persistent and grassroots mobilizations in the last decade, that opposition parties also took inspiration in terms of issue salience, in terms of political agenda setting. And this includes young women, both self-identify as secular women, as well as young Muslim women who fight the same fight in a deeply patriarchal, gendered society where nationalism is mingled with and performed through masculine performances in everyday life, right? And young women's movement has achieved an impressive resonance, an impressive perseverance, we know that, even though they are excluded by the government from any sort of policymaking processes or agenda setting. And they chose a strategy that I label in my work tactful contention. And this is key for, I think, politicization of youth, but also in general social movements in Turkey. So tactful contention plays a considerable role building internal strength and resilience for women's movement. And there are two discrete factors behind tactful contention: their choice of organizational form, and also we've already mentioned that their wide action repertoire. So organizational form means that they are grassroots, they are flexible, horizontal networks, and often young women activists emphasize this to be able to remain autonomous from governmental pressure, determine their own agendas. This is why their organization remains as a loose network and relies on mostly, crowdfunding. And the second factor of tactful contention allows these young women activist mobilizations to pursue a flexible and multidimensional mobilization as an alternative to more formal politics, formal participation, direct lobbying, advocacy, and mobilize large numbers. So they rely on self-sustaining methods of mobilization, that social movement type protest, sit-ins, performance, but also besides the contentious action, they resort to alternative mediums to mobilize, right? Litigation, democratic innovations, organization of public sphere. It also takes the form of more hidden and leisure-oriented activity, as Professor Kaya was mentioning, like blogging, using social media, stories posting for politicized commentary, adopting music and other artistic methods. So we should testify here, however, most of the time, this type of mobilizations are very creative, very engaging, but they are geared towards more temporary or locally oriented type of events. For example, young women are organizing protests and public awareness campaigns for each and every femicide case in the country, keeping track of court hearings. Then there is a unilateral decision by the government to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention, and they have to turn to mobilize there in that area in a way very quickly, focusing on their limited resources and mobilization skills for another urgent pressing issue. Lecardi terms this as presentification in social movements. That is, a concern at hand right now, right here, becomes the center of the concern. So youth politicization in Turkey seems to be driven right now by this presentification. That is, young people have individual motivations, meanings, attribute to politicization. And presentification can be an opportunity for young people to be a change agent that opposition parties emulate and learn from in the long term, because their multiple mediums of action provide ample opportunities, as I said, for tactical switches, and in a way that youth politicization, in my opinion, defies these generational hierarchies, telling young people how to be, how to act. It also defies the idea of this post-1988 political youth. However, presentification of youth politicization might also be related to or cause disappointment with the formal political participation, such as voting, lack of trust in party politics, or lack of trust in institutions in the long term. And this might lead to a decline in conventional participation among youth that is, for example, widespread in Western Europe, and the spread of unconventional participation more and more through informal, non-institutionalized, personally meaningful, individually oriented, but somehow divorced from long-term agenda and projects. I think in this sense that youth politicization can be a double-edged sword that might create young people as a force for change for the next elections and, in my opinion, for the future, but also might be also a kind of limiting factor in the long term for their engagement in politics, particularly in formal politics in the long term.
Thank you so much, Bilge. Haydar, would you like to add anything? I mean, considering all these mobilizations are still happening at the expense of the Kurdish movement, because many political parties in the opposition as well are, excluding Kurdish actors from their own negotiations. So, what do you think they are doing, and what does the HDP do, especially to keep young people engaged?
I think HDP developed a discourse and an image that appeals to young Kurds, not only in real cities, but also, especially in metropolitan centers. in Western Turkey, so I think it can get a lot of support from young Kurds in the election. Even the youth groups that I work with were a strong supporter of course HDP, but even those Kurds whose families do not support Kurdish movement or HDP, they are turning to HDP. I think that's why, especially in this election, it can be ineffective.
Thank you. And I know that your fieldwork was a few years ago, but I still wanted to ask, when they talk about the opposition potential presidential candidates, do you know anything about the Kurdish young people's perceptions about the potential candidates from the opposition?
Unfortunately, I don't have any.
Okay, I just tried my luck. Do you have any other comments to add to our discussion? I think our conversations show that youth movements in Turkey exist, and they have agency, and they have different motivations. And but we clearly observed again that young people have a lot of different needs. They belong to different groups. Sometimes they overlap. Sometimes they are diverse. But youth groups are extremely heterogeneous and with multiple motivations, like the Turkish society itself. So I wish we had more room to invite other experts, for example, who could give us the Muslim youth perspective or women's movements perspective, LGBTI, etc. I wish we had more time and more episodes dedicated to this. But I think our conversations show that we really need to discuss young people's engagement in Turkish politics today from a variety of perspectives, and I'm sure we'll find really interesting things. So it's not just about the elections, but this is the future generations we are talking about. So thank you so much for your contributions today. And if you don't have any other comments, we can now close the webinar. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.